Global red meat production will be record large in 2018, driven by strong growth in the major exporting countries and especially the U.S. Efficiency gains in much of the world mean global pork production is expected to be record large, with notable records to be set in the top exporting regions. Beef cow inventories are off earlier highs, and the only countries expected to set new highs this year are Brazil and Argentina. Environmental constraints, plus overall higher production costs and aging farmers, will continue to limit production expansion in major importer countries. This should support continued growth in red meat trade. Overall, expect the major exporters to continue to drive global production growth. Looking ahead, further production growth could be limited by many factors, with disease remaining a major wildcard risk. Consumer demand remains critical, especially at this time of larger global supplies. Over the past 10 years, production growth has been strongest for poultry, seafood, and pork, but these growth rates are expected to slow. Muted growth in beef and sheep meat production over the past 10 years means there is a potential for stronger growth over the next 10 years, partly driven by consumers adding more of these higher-priced meats to their diets. But beef and sheep meat production growth will continue to be constrained by pasture conditions and weather. Corn and soybean exports are dominated by big beef countries, while major meat importers are also the leading buyers of grain. Generally, costs of production are expected to remain low. For pork, poultry, aquaculture, and grain-finished beef, the feed situation is critical, and affordable feed costs have underpinned the growth in meat production. Corn and soybeans have seen the strongest growth in production and exports. For corn and soybeans, global production and exports are heavily concentrated in 3 countries: the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina. Expect continued growth in grain trade to support local meat production, even as actual meat trade also continues to grow. Partly due to the need to import feed for domestic production, prices are much higher in the major importer countries. A mix of consumer demand for domestic products and protectionism enables these price spreads. In general, hog and pork prices have been relatively flat, with the exception of the 2014 spike due to PED virus in North America and Asia. Production growth over the next 3 to 5 years could be constrained if producers start losing money, as is the case currently in China. Similar to hogs, cattle prices are sharply higher for the major importers versus the major exporters, and prices have trended higher in these major import markets, underpinning the growth in trade. While most major exporter prices last year were lower than the 5-year average, with the exception of Australia, where producers are attempting to rebuild the herd following drought. Perhaps relatively flat cattle prices partly explain the muted global production growth. It will take higher prices to stimulate greater productivity of global cattle production. It might take further economic growth, meaning greater beef demand, before we see sustained growth in global beef production.
Economists generally underestimated economic growth in 2017 and have strong expectations for this year, although there is less certainty about the medium term. In addition to concerns about trade tensions, coming changes from rising interest rates and reductions in quantitative easing, rising oil prices, and the potential for higher inflation could all impact consumer demand for red meat. But for the short term, strong economic growth continues to underpin demand, including for higher-end and branded products. When looking at where our products will increasingly be consumed, global indicators suggest huge growth in the relatively new category, e-commerce. But the global population will also continue to dine out and buy from convenience stores, trends supported by the busy lifestyles and often single households as we have seen in markets like Korea. Still, Grocery stores will hold the largest total sales dollars and see robust growth, although not the double-digit rates seen in the other categories. Red meat has benefited as consumers increasingly embrace protein in natural products, meaning less processed food. Our challenge is to continue to convey our story to consumers in an increasingly competitive field where alternative proteins are making progress. At the same time, we must focus on high quality and convenient products to fit consumer lifestyles and desires. Looking ahead, fish, driven by aquaculture in China, is to remain the most consumed protein. But poultry has surpassed pork, and all proteins are to see continued consumption growth. Trade is critical to consumption growth as consumers benefit from affordable products of their choosing when markets are open. Imported seafood and beef account for the biggest shares of consumption, indicative of their unique, resource-intensive production methods and seasonality. Even in the most open market in the world, with some of the highest land prices and rental rates, these traditional markets can be found in the heart of Hong Kong as demand for fresh meat continues. Demand for high-end imported chilled meat from all over the world also thrives. And we continue to see more branded products on the pork side as well. Markets are upscaling as they strive to compete for customers across retail, food service, and online platforms. High-quality red meat is benefiting, and as long as economic growth continues, this trend should continue.
Underpinned by production growth and growing demand in regions without sufficient domestic production, global beef exports will be record large this year. Expect export growth to continue, underpinned by demand in Asia. Global pork exports saw the big jump in 2016, driven by China's short supply situation. But with larger global production this year, it's going to take further growth in per capita consumption of imported pork outside of China for exports to grow. Another production cycle in China could drive further growth in trade within the next 5 years. Continued growth in exports could come at lower prices following the recent rebound. Export prices remain below the 5-year average last year, and it will probably take a disease event or China's next production cycle to see export prices move higher. Mexico's relatively higher prices reflect their focus on Japan and chilled single-rib bellies and CT butts to Korea. Beef export price trends are more mixed and with a wider spread. The U.S. has the highest prices with exports of grain-fed beef, and even with growth in production, prices last year were higher than the 5-year average, driven by surging demand for chilled U.S. beef in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Australia's prices have increased during herd rebuilding, and the same for New Zealand, while Canada and Paraguay's prices have also been supported by limited production. Poultry exports are dominated by the U.S. and Brazil, but their import markets are highly diversified, partly due to market access barriers. Since poultry is generally much cheaper than red meat, they are also the pioneers in up-and-coming markets, and the export growth has largely occurred outside China. For pork, import demand grew in the rest of the world last year, and that trend is continuing this year, essentially offsetting China's slowdown in buying. For beef, China remains a key driver of growth, and this is expected to continue. We are all familiar with the drivers of trade, and it seems that disease-related restrictions and trade agreements will continue to shape trade flows, often offsetting the natural comparative advantages in production. Expect to see continued shifts also driven by changes in the major buyers, such as Russia shifting to a net exporter, and what other countries will pick up the momentum if and when China's buying slows. For beef, South America has become heavily reliant on China, and for pork that is the case for the EU and Canada, and for the US for pork variety meats, while we are more reliant on Mexico for pork cut exports. These are just some of the bilateral agreements reached or being negotiated at the moment, plus other wildcard factors that could very well impact red meat trade in the near-medium term. What will we see in changes for business and technology, as well as the potential changes in policy? The vast majority of red meat is still traded as frozen commodity products differentiated by cut specs. This slide includes processed poultry products included in most commonly traded sausages. But in general, processed beef and pork products account for just a small share of global trade. Is there a way to add more value? There are challenges, including the ability to meet local tastes as well as shelf life for chilled processed meats. There is also potential for demand growth with e-commerce platforms and the continued drive for convenience, as well as demand for protein snacks. But natural resources remain limited and favor cattle, hog, sheep production growth in the major exporter countries in the short-medium term. Further growth will require continued productivity gains and consumer demand for our products.